So I'm so excited to have a special guest, Dr. Jessica Smedley, also known as Dr. Jess, on us to have our conversation. Today we will be covering Black resistance and Black romance and mental health. So we're talking about, our main theme is Black resistance, and then we're looking at how mental health interplays with different topics. And the topic for this week is Black romance. So I'm so excited to have you on here, Dr. Jess. We've had other conversations before, and I know we can go on and on. So I'm just gonna want to thank you for being willing to join this conversation. And I can't wait to share with our audience all that you have to share.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It is great to be here. And yes, we can go on and on. So this will be a great conversation.
Yeah. So do you want to do a quick intro about who you are and what you're doing currently?
Sure. So I'm a licensed clinical psychologist in Washington, D.C., independent practice, Smedley Psychological Services. I teach part-time at Howard University, which is very exciting. Likewise at George Washington University. I am the president-elect at DC Psychological Association and very active in APA leadership, and recently co-authored a very exciting, groundbreaking book, which is why we're talking today, right? Before the Broom.
Yes.
So that are some of the things that keep me occupied.
I love it. Add an author to your titles. Love it, love it. So I think that's a great segue. So you wrote this book, it's called Before the Broom. So tell us what was going on in the community that really inspired, and thinking about the Black community, what was happening in the Black community that really inspired you to write this book, to want to be part of this project of writing Before the Broom?
Absolutely. So I obviously have to give credit to my co-authors, Dr. Erica Holmes and Dr. Renecia Lark, who are in California. Dr. Holmes and I go back to the early 2000s, where I was in my early graduate training, and both have a history of, couples and marriage work in the past. And so she invited me to this project. We actually co-authored a textbook chapter too, which will be out later this spring. That'll be in a Black couples therapy textbook. And so as an outsource of that, we wrote this book to say, hey, we wrote this textbook chapter in argument of why a premarital curriculum is needed for Black couples. So let's go ahead and write the curriculum and the workbook also. So she's extremely creative and, excited about the field, obviously. But we know that there's lots of couples work that's amazing, the Gottmans and Hendricks and, all these amazing writers that are out there. But there's nothing out there specifically for us.
Yes, I was so interested that you say that, because I was looking around. Someone had mentioned the Gottmans. I was like, oh, what is there for us? So I'm just excited to see what you all will do with this, because I'm already imagining 50 things you could do with that.
Yeah.
But let's talk about so the title is Before the Broom, and it comes from this whole idea, jumping the broom is, I assume. So let's talk about, what does jumping the broom represent? How does that represent Black resistance?
Absolutely. So the history of the broom, I don't have all the resources immediately handy, but the history of the broom goes far back to Africa. And the sticks of the broom historically represented the foundation of a home. When a couple got married, the sticks represent the foundation. This is how we're going to build. Over time, as the culture came to the States, jumping the broom became more of a symbolic representation of resistance, because we know that people who were enslaved were forbidden to marry. And so rather than going through, a formal process that was accessible to everyone, jumping the broom was extremely important to our liberation, to our celebration, to our culturally relevant symbolism of love and commitment.
Yeah, so that is, it's interesting, because I had never heard about it till I came to this country, and like you said, what a beautiful way that we've been able to kind of work around, right? We're always figuring out kind of the workaround. And so while Black couples were prohibited from legal marriage, they found using the broom as a to symbolize their union. So just love that. Again, that resistance has been there throughout this whole period of enslavement.
Right.
So as we think about Black romance and Black love, what are just a few qualities that you think make up a healthy or successful relationship? What are things as we, we're talking to couples out there, we're listening in, what are some signs of a good, healthy relationship? And we know, like, couples, one of my friends always told me, like, marriage is hard work, it's work, right? But what are some of those foundational things, right? Every day isn't going to be peachy and happiness necessarily, right? There are going to be periods of conflict. But what are those signs that lets you know that the person that you're with, this is someone who I can be with, this is going to be a healthy, successful relationship?
Absolutely. So one of the things that I often say to peers, to clients, to anyone I'm speaking about with couples is never underestimate the power of honesty and vulnerability. Because that informs a sense of emotional safety, right? And so when I speak of honesty, it's beyond the integrity of, oh, no cheating. Sure, of course, nobody wants that sort of issue in their relationship. But everyday honesty, people have a hard time saying, I don't like that meal that you cook, or I don't like when you leave your shoes over here. There are all these fears about these trivial feedback comments. And then when we think about vulnerability, it's an issue of safety. And so it's, are you okay giving feedback? Are you okay talking about past pain from family or parents or fears even? And so I think that those two qualities are often taken for granted. And so if we can attack that issue of honesty and vulnerability, then we have a great foundation to be able to then talk about in-laws, children, money,
right, exactly,
all of the things that we think about.
Yeah. So that honesty is, I know you talked about kind of sharing feedback, but also that vulnerability is to be able to receive that, right? And to not lash out when you get that feedback, to receive that with a sense of love that it was given, right? That allows the couple to, again, create that emotional safety in that relationship. Like, I may have hard things to say to you, but you can take it. It may not feel good, right? Because sometimes, 20 years into the relationship with my husband, right? There are things that are said to me, and now I'm getting used to, like, the style, or and there are times where we've had to say, like, actually, I don't like when you say this thing. Can you say this? I'm going to hear it better if you say it this way. Right. And so that ability to have that communication too, I think also that communication is like, the foundation of that honesty and that vulnerability as well.
Absolutely.
That is, I just think about that, right? In like, how are you vulnerable with someone you're meeting, right? And how does that show up from day one to year 50 in that relationship? And it grows and evolves, right? But so important to, it is something that you have to continually be working on and not taking it for granted.
Absolutely. And that's why we're focusing on couples, but that's also why individual work is important. And so a lot of times we might have our own blind spots that require some maintenance or check-ins over time, just to make sure that we're not taking out inappropriate things on our partners.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, so you're in a relationship and you're coming to a place of honesty and vulnerability. We're talking to people who maybe, recently partnering up, or, in a relationship for some time. And I think that, relationships are journeys, right? And so I think another healthy thing within a relationship is you're growing together. So you're talking about that individual, right? So you're people as individuals coming into this union. And sometimes what I've seen is people kind of lose who they are in service of the other person, right? And so, let's talk about what are some of those relationship red flags, things that are signs that a relationship is not going well. So I just named one, right? Where you aren't allowed to be yourself, or you kind of dim yourself or put yourself last in service of the partner,
Mhm.
right? And I've seen relationships then where you're not growing, you're creating the space for this other person to grow, and then they outgrow you, right?
Right.
And so how are we continually growing in a relationship? So what are some of those red flags? What are some of those relationship red flags that you might call out?
Right. Yeah, I love that you already highlighted the imbalance that can happen, which is why it's so important to discuss value systems. Because if our values don't match, then that absolutely serves as red flags. Often when we think about red flags, we go automatically to the safety issues or violence issues or abuse issues, which are extremely important. But there are also these subtle things like differences in how you see raising children or your faith, practices, or money issues or boundaries with family members and in-laws and blended families if you come to the relationship with children. And so having these differences in values can absolutely spark, issues down the road.
So, but Dr. Jess, like talking about values, is that sexy? Like, is that like people started to date? It's like, how does that come up, right? Like, I'm just like, those don't always seem to be the like fun, exciting things when people are starting to get together, right? Do you have these sit down and have a conversation about values? Does it just kind of come up? And part of it, like you have to know what your values are first, right? Before you can even have that conversation or assess whether that person kind of matches or aligns. But yeah, how is it? Because that when you talk about that, I'm like, a couple's really gonna sit down and have a conversation about values? Like, what does that look like, right? Let's be real here.
It may not be a black and white checklist, but when you're going on these dates and you're having conversations, it's about being intentional.
Yeah.
And so historically, we haven't been taught dating skills, if you will. We have ideas in our heads about boy meets girl, person meets person.
There's a chemistry, right?
Yep.
The Big Bang.
It's supposed to automatically fall in place because we're connected. We like each other. But we haven't talked about how we were raised, how we spend money, how we see ourselves raising children, what our own emotional behavioral patterns are, what our needs are, what our routines are, what our faith practices are. And so if we go into a dating situation being very intentional and self-aware, the more likely we will have better outcomes with dating and long-term relationships.
Right. Okay. I love that. So I'm already hearing a thing that you could do. A practical thing is to spend some time, journal, write it down, talking about, but what are the things that are important to you? What are the values? How do you articulate your own values first before you even go out on those dates, right? Spend some time with yourself, thinking about what your values are. And then it's like the listening. Then when I'm meeting with people, I'm listening for how they talk about their own family, how they talk about their mom or their dad, right? How they talk about money, how they spend money when we're together. So those things align. And I think one of the things that I've noticed is people often people often are showing you their best selves when you're dating. And and a friend also shared this to me, like, you can't expect people to change. People are who they are. So if the behavior that you're seeing when you're dating, don't think that that's going to change once you get married or form some long-term relationship. That is just, you can imagine that that's the best that you're going to get. And if that's not working for you in that moment, then it's not, you cannot, not that people can't change, but that, imagine that they're putting forward their best foot when when you're dating in that relationship. Would you agree with that? Would you?
I generally do. I think that there is an important topic around developmental stages of life and development. And so I think dating in 20s and 30s looks different from dating in 40s, 50s, and 60s, right? Because there's a general difference in evolving character, integrity, and understanding life experiences. And so I think that's an important conversation. But generally, yes, I do think that certainly matters in how we show up.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so one more question, and then this last question, and then we'll kind of share anything that you want to, any tips you want to share for our Black romance folks out there. So, I know you do a lot with your faith and with Black churches, and we have this idea of couples therapy as an intervention, right? And I know sometimes people worry about couples. I hear a number of people, in relationship, one person may want to do the couples therapy, one person doesn't want to. And I think there's a lot of, kind of stigma around couples therapy in general, but then couples therapy, people may feel they're not going to get a fair shake in the therapy process. So we want you to know that couples therapists, you definitely want to make sure the person is trained to provide couples therapy, because that is a special training that people go through. And that, the therapist does not take sides, right? They're really kind of a neutral party, and they're really helping you think about what you want, what goals you have for your relationship. They're not invested in whether you stay together or whether you get divorced, like that is, or whether you separate. That is a decision that the couple has to make. But I'd like to talk a little bit about kind of what is the differences between couples therapy and, say, those meetings that you may have with your religious leader, for folks who are of faith, and maybe start first with talking to their religious leader about how are they navigating a challenge in their relationship. Or do you see that there are differences, and what do each piece has to offer?
Sure. Yeah, that's such a great question, because I think that they're equally important and extremely complementary to one another, especially when done well. As you said, yes, I am a person of faith. And so as a believer in the Christian faith, I think it's important to understand why marriage is rooted in whatever your belief system is, but what that means, because your faith system will really inform how you make decisions, how you define commitment, how you define family, and the ultimate foundation of the purpose of why your relationship exists. Yet there's also this missing component, or needed component, I shouldn't say missing, but this needed component of understanding human behavior, which is where couples therapy comes in. Because when you have someone who is trained in human behavior science and the things that we've been discussing in this conversation, then that is absolutely such an important balance and space where couples can really have greater understanding to strengthen their foundation and understanding of their relationship and their own patterns, their patterns as a couple, and further strengthen their goals as a couple outside of the faith realm.
Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. So the idea is that it's not, you don't have to choose, right? That they're both things that can help build and strengthen that relationship.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, last question. Any tips or advice that you would give to couples who are just starting out, or couples who've been in it for a minute? What are some things, maybe one or two things that we could do? And I put me in there because, we've been a couple for 20 years now. We're just noticing that, which is like hard to believe. But again, that there's always things you want to kind of, keep fresh and check in on. But what are some tips to maintaining a healthy balance for your own mental health as an individual, but also the well-being of that union?
Absolutely. First of all, congratulations on 20. That's amazing.
Thank you. Thank you. I know, right? It is. I was like, I can't imagine. I look back at pictures like, oh my God, we look so young.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
If I were to, there's a lot of things, but if I were to prioritize two things, I think being creative, and it doesn't mean planning extravagant things or dates or vacations. Those are fun too.
Yes.
But what about weekly check-ins? What about weekly, oh, I cooked your favorite meal today? Just creating those spaces where you are showing that you're actively invested, you're actually actively thinking about your partner, you're actively invested in making sure that the relationship is where it needs to be. So there's this sort of, if you will, to use the five love languages language, that's sort of just action-based. Are we checking in? Are we communicating? Are we demonstrating? Are we being intentional?
Yeah.
And then the other thing I think is community. What supports do you have in place?
Mhm.
Is it that friend circle that you trust? Are there other couples that you spend time with that you trust? Just a sort of accountability
Mhm.
check in.
Mhm. I love that. So building community, make sure you have community
Mhm.
and being creative. So doing little things. So I think that there's another tip within there, like understanding what your partner's love language is. And there are
Right.
lots, I think there's a test out there. I know my husband and I did it a while ago. Mine is quality time. So we referenced that, right? His is act of service, so
Mhm.
like, let's watch a movie together. Like, I feel close to you when we do that. He's like, can you clean the house, right? Or can you clean your space, right? And I know if I do that, he's gonna feel good, right? So I think that's a great tip, right? Understanding kind of what each other needs in that space.
Right.
Oh, this has been wonderful. Oh my God. So I do want to ask one question because this last thing, promise. So you have the book is called Before the Broom. And so when I saw that, I assumed like for people who are getting together, but my sense is this is at any point along that relationship journey, right? Because there's probably always something that we could do to improve and kind of
Yeah.
work on our relationship.
Yeah. So we specifically said for dating, engaged, and newly married African American couples.
Mm-hmm.
But honestly, I feel like it's a timeless resource
Yeah.
because a
Yeah.
lot of us are in relationships where maybe we didn't have the depth of this understanding that we're trying to offer the community now. And so
Right.
why not check in
Right.
and do some renewal, if you will, of
Exactly.
understanding and recommitting to the relationship.
Hmm. Yeah. Love that. Love that. Well, thank you, Dr. Jess. Always wonderful to speak with you, and can't wait to share this with all. But thank you again for your time, and thank you for writing that book along with your co-authors.
Thank you so much for having me. Always a pleasure.
All right.